Hello to my colleagues across the Australian Public Service and welcome to the Connecting Us podcast. My name is Mif Nazette and I work at PM&C. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this continent and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, this year has been a really big year for the APS in so many ways, but in this edition of Connecting Us, we particularly want to highlight the work of the APS on the front line. So those colleagues who work face-to-face with members of the public or who have been on the coalface of the APS pandemic response. And to chat about this today, we have two guests from the National Indigenous Australians Agency, Deputy CEO Letitia Hope and Assistant Director Katrina O'Donnell. So thanks for being with me today in Canberra, Letitia, and Katrina remotely from Dubbo.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
All right, let's start off with a bit of context. Letitia, could you just tell us briefly about your role in the agency and also, for those of us who don't know, just the importance of the NIAA's national footprint?
Great. Thanks, Miff. Firstly, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we meet on today and pay my respects to Elder past and present. As people may know, the NIAA came into being on the 1st of July 2019. With our executive orders that stood us up after a machinery of government change. And shortly after that, on the 1st of December in 2019, the CEO, Ray Griggs, did a restructure of the organisation. And as part of that restructure of the organisation, there was the development of the Deputy CEO Operations and Delivery role, my role. And what that saw was a Deputy CEO looking after the policy and program areas, my colleague Blair Excel, and myself as the Deputy CEO of Operations and Delivery looking after what we call the regional presence and the operational and delivery aspects. So what does that mean? We have a national footprint across the NIAA of about 70 different offices. We have about 500 staff that work across our national footprint, and we are in around 400 communities per year. So quite a big presence, and it's a really important part of the function of the NIAA. We're unique in the Commonwealth Public Service. We are an agency that has everything from the strategic policy, program management and design through to frontline service delivery, which is quite unique in the APS context. Our regional footprint enables us to develop really deep relationships in place. So in community, working with community on the ground around community issues and highlighting community priorities. And of course, fitting that back into the centre then, which helps, design programs and policies, etc. So in the pandemic context, our place-based intelligence was really important. So we had, from the very beginning of the emerging pandemic, we had staff on the ground across those locations providing intelligence to Canberra about what was really happening and what were the real risks. And that ability to be able to have that intelligence, particularly in an environment where you're in emergency response mode, was fundamental to our role that we played in relation to the response to the pandemic.
Okay, yeah, that does sound like a unique sort of perspective to be able to draw on your own staff and their knowledge rather than having to do a really quick sort of whip around to all your stakeholders. Sounds definitely valuable. And Katrina, I believe you're based in Dubbo as of this week, but recently you were in Broken Hill, I believe. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from, what attracted you to the public service and your role?
Sure. I am a Murrawari woman. My family are from Brewarrina, but I was born and raised in Bourke. I moved to Broken Hill when I was 19, so, 27 years ago. So I married into a Barkindji family, a large Barkindji family. I've actually worked in quite a few different fields before I came to this department. So I worked in a radio station. I worked for the Western Aboriginal Legal Service. I went to the Aboriginal Land Council, so I worked for the Broken Hill Aboriginal Land Council. I went to ADDIC, so aged care and disability. And then I went to child protection, and then from there I came to this department. So I've been with NIAA now for 4 years. I'm loving it. My region that I work in is the Murdi Parky region, which is the river people. which is great because my children are traditional owners and I have that connection through them. But I also I travel quite a fair bit. So within that Mudipaki region, we have 16 communities. Out of those communities, I work in the Far West region. So I have communities like Menindee, Wilcannia, Durton, Ivanhoe, Broken Hill. So some of these communities are a few hours away, 3 hours to Durton, 2 hours to Wilcannia, an hour to Menindee. So we're kind of spread out a fair bit. And if I had to come to Dubbo, it's going to take me 9 hours, which it did most recently with my move. So we are quite isolated where we are. We're out in the middle of nowhere, and there is a lot of remote communities in the areas that I work in. So very passionate about that area. And what attracted me to the public service, I guess, was all the roles I held previously. I kind of felt like they had, in some ways, life had given me the opportunity and had led me into the role I am today. You know, where I feel like I understand the issues in the communities. I understand living in a small community from being from Burke, so I can relate to some of those issues. Also knowing that each community is different.
Right, yeah, thanks for that. It sounds like you really are steeped in that area, and your insider knowledge, I'm sure, would be so valuable to the NIAA's work there. So, Letitia, you mentioned a little bit earlier about what the pandemic has meant for Indigenous people. Can we hear a little bit more about what remote communities have experienced and what work the NIAA has been doing in response to that?
Sure. The first point I would make is that we're not out of risk yet. So, we've been successful so far, and I can talk a little bit about the range of things we've done. But it's really important for us to not be complacent. So, we're very well aware that our Indigenous communities, due to a whole combination of factors, particularly in remote areas, are quite vulnerable. So we can't let our guard down yet. We've done excellent work, and I'll talk a little bit about that, including Katrina will give some examples about how we've attacked that or kind of managed that issue. But it is an important point to make. But look, our primary aim in relation to COVID-19 was to keep it out of community. What we wanted to make sure is that we didn't have to try and contend with it or contain it. We just wanted it not there. So a lot of the work we did in relation to that was really around limiting the movement of people in and out of community, and that's probably been one of the most significant measures across the responses. There are other responses that we've had. But, of course, when you try to limit movement of people, it comes with a range of challenges. So, maintaining access to food and medicine and essential supplies has been a real challenge, and harnessing new ways of us to be able to keep our connection to community and keep those relationships strong. But I should say that some of the most innovative practices have actually come out of community themselves, out of community leaders and community elders, particularly in relation to dealing with traditional business or cultural practices. So there's been an incredible strength in relation to that. So across all of the regions and here in Canberra, we work really closely with our Commonwealth, state and territory government counterparts, with select industries and also the Indigenous sector and community themselves to really coordinate our efforts to minimise both the health and the non-health impacts of COVID. Part of our coordinating and convening role is to make sure that people aren't actually tripping over themselves in relation to, well-intended bunch of people running at an issue. So that ability to pull parties together and to facilitate those discussions and those right discussions for the right kinds of actions in a unique way for the place that we're in, but also in a universal way that leads to, policy making, for example, whether it's point of care testing within a community or whether it's border restrictions, etc. That feed and that relationship from intel from the ground feeding back into Canberra has been a critical part of our response to managing the pandemic.
Okay, so I guess I hadn't really thought about that before, having to be specific to individual communities, but also making sure that there's a coordinated effort. And I imagine that that could only come about with the on-the-ground intel that your NIAA staff have, and also the relationships in the community.
Absolutely. So, you can't draw on relationships in the way that we did through the pandemic unless the relationship is already there. You can't withdraw what you haven't deposited. So I think the really important point that I would make about the role that the NIAA has played in all its previous guises, when it was part of PM&C as IAG, or even the agencies it was before that, is that that kind of facilitation and relationship management has come from relationships that have been invested in for a very long time. And Katrina talked a bit about trust before. The ability to be able to walk into a community and have a really frank conversation about what's going on in that community, and then convene all the various actors and players within that community to get a right response for that community, and then also kind of feed that up through the various jurisdictional mechanisms to get good policy, is one of the real strengths of the NIAA. And it's one of the real strengths that we saw highlighted in relation to our response to COVID-19 and the pandemic. So, it's why the regional presence for us, people like our staff, like Katrina, and we have 11 regions across the country. And as I said earlier, about 500 staff that work within that national and, that regional footprint. We also have 500 staff here in Canberra who work in the Canberra footprint. But that ability to be in place and develop those deep relationships and that real sense of intelligence about what is actually happening and what is required is one of the great strengths of NIAA. And I think we saw that in the results that we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months in terms of the management of not just the pandemic, but a range of issues.
Okay. So could you take us through a little bit about how the awareness of the pandemic developed in Western New South Wales, particularly because we have Katrina here, and any examples of the NIAA's work with remote communities during that period? You touched on making sure that people didn't move too widely, but also remained connected, making sure that food was still available, those kinds of things.
Sure. So I might flick over to Katrina. Katrina, you can cast your mind back to the start of the pandemic, and when did it become real, and what were you telling people in the community on the ground?
So in February when the pandemic was in its infancy, we contributed to the First Nations COVID team for the Murdi-Parky region. So we all came together, Community Working Party chairs, the chair of the Murdi-Parky Regional Assembly, and other key agencies such as Newswalk, AA. We were all at the table speaking on issues that all the communities were having. Some of the communities had different issues and some had similar ones. So we all took a role, a collaborative role. We all took an action in it that was responsible for us, that, we also were responsible in getting the word out and having the community's voices heard. So, again, I'm very lucky to have a regional manager and a senior advisor that have taken these voices and concerns to where they need to be heard. There was a lot of scared people and vulnerable people in the community, and there was a lot of technical language. So a lot of communication that was coming out wasn't really culturally appropriate for one, but it just wasn't appropriate for some of the communities. It was confusing. So we had conversations with the health service, and we had different flyers had been put out, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, Wilcannia food service soon, but that sort of came in a role, getting some health information out through that as well. But the community was scared. Wilcannia, for example, is on a highway, a major highway straight through the main street from Sydney to Adelaide. So people were pulling up and grabbing fuel, and also wanting to get back because the borders were closing. So that was another issue that we were feeding that communication up at the same time. And they wanted to shut the highway. People were worried about food security, and there was some instances of people not getting what they needed. So these are the things that were real in the community, and these are the things that we were part of, finding solutions with the community, because it was the community that guides us.
So, Katrina, I know that you have a really great story about Monica's kitchen. Do you want to talk us through that? Because it's a great a story about how to respond.
Sure. Actually, I was just on the phone with her last night. So we around the 12th of April, around that height of awareness of COVID, I was told about a local couple in Broken Hill that were making meals for vulnerable people in the community. And so I thought, okay, I'll look them up. I went on to social media and I found them and I sent them a message and said, hey, do you think you might extend some of these meals to Kenya? Well, they called me straight away because I'd left my number, and she called me. She said, we'd love to, absolutely love to. So she put up a post up on Facebook and said, our neighbours in Kenya and Menindee, are finding it hard at the moment, accessing food and that, and how, can we see if we can get some stuff going so I can cook up some meals this Friday. And just even reading the comments underneath, yes, I'd love to, where can I drop it off? It was just this whole community had come together to help their neighbours, which was great. So I'd contacted Monica, the Community Working Party chair, and said to her, how many meals, how many vulnerable people roughly would you think, and she gave me a rough amount and numbers. I think it was around 50 at the time. So I called the couple in Broken Hill and they said, yep, sure, no worries. I said, what do you need? They said, well, we've got all this, we've got the meat already for spaghetti. We're going to make spaghetti. We've got the meat. How about, you can get some people to drop off some tins and stuff, and some people are dropping off some other. So me and my daughter went straight over. We grabbed a whole heap of things and we donated it. And then Monica was coming into town 2 days a week because her husband was doing dialysis. So she came in on the Tuesday and she picked up the meals. He cooked it, I think, on Monday night. Yeah, she picked it up Tuesday. She took them back into the community, and that night I called her. She said, oh, my goodness, she said, there's just people were so happy and we were giving she said the community was so excited to have the meals, even just to have that contact, because at that stage people weren't leaving their house. So they were having a conversation. The police were coming around, the Marama Health Service was coming around, and Monica had organised, some of the family members to deliver some of the meals as well. Well, the next day I called her because we were still hyped up over it. Called her the next day and she said, you know what? She said, I think we can do this ourselves. And I said, you know what? I think you can too. So I said, all right, what do you need me to do? And she said, well, do you reckon you can see if you can get some meat or get some donations and different things? I said, yep, right, I'm on it. And at that time, AA, we'd contacted AA, and they had organised for some donations. Marama had gotten on board. So by, I think, a couple of hours had gone by and we'd had all these different connections into the food service. We were able to go to some butchers. Had Phil Kickett working for us, who was an amazing engager. He's left us now to go to Perth. But he had gotten some meat. He'd gotten actually 2 lots of meat, and he'd also gotten, and we're talking bulk amounts of meat. Bread from Coles. Coles came in and they delivered. We've got a few other donations. And then I was talking to Monica that night on the phone again, and she said, oh, well, where am I going to store all this meat? And she said, there's no freezer in the community hall. So the community hall said that they would, the Shire came in, said you can have the hall for free. There's a kitchen in there. So I rang Greg from the general manager from the Shire Council and said, hey, Greg, do you think you might be able to grab a freezer for the hall for the community meals? And he said, yep, no worries. So we got that in. Marama had donated all of their equipment for them to cook the meals. And she said, you know what, I've got I've got my daughters, they're going to come around, they're going to do the volunteering. I've got Forgetty, who was from CRC, she came around and helped with the cooking. And so, from that, the police got involved. They were transporting the meals. And what was really great about that was the flow-on effect. So he said, when new police come out to Kenya, we're actually going to have them go out and deliver meals. That's going to be part of their induction. So, so we're not going to communities and we're not pulling up for bad news or to going to, houses. We're actually, coming in and meeting families and, a few of the other flow-on effects too was, people are getting healthy meals 3 days a week. Carers are having a day off of cooking, so they get a little bit of respite. Mental health's improved as well. That's one of the things that Monica was very clear about, that she said, people are struggling with the isolation. So having a nice warm meal was making them feel good, and a bit of sweets. And so she was saying, she could see how happy people were when she was dropping the meals off. The economic developments opportunities in the future for a sustainable small business has already been talked about. Marama are building a $5 million primary health service in Wilcannia, and in part of that we visited not long ago Marama, and they had a structure already built, and then in the back there was Monica's kitchen. So that's going to continue on now. It's still going to this day, 3 days a meal, solely run by volunteers.
It's a great story of a real strength-based approach where, you've got health services, police, the Shire Council, community organisations, elders and leaders and traditional owners, family members and community members all working together to build this great social and community capital. It's such a fabulous story. So I guess, Katrina, you've been instrumental in gathering and translating and feeding up those local impacts, especially from Wilcannia. And you've covered a lot of ground in that story, that amazing story. I guess what I wanted to ask you was, what do you think some of the flow-on effects forward are? So we've had this great response in the community. What's the future potential? What do you think is going to come out of this?
Well, certainly food service, and we're hoping that, for a sustainable business. So, I mentioned earlier about Marama building the new primary health service, and part of that will be Monica's kitchen at the back. So, that the hope is that there'll be, some employment opportunities. There's an economic development component around it. There's also those flow-on effects that we talked about as well. And just the opportunity to link in with aged care, the possibilities are endless.
Katrina, thank you so much for sharing with us today, and congratulations to both you and your team on your leadership that you've demonstrated. And that's a daily thing. We are very lucky to have you in the agency, and as is the APS. And I think what I would say to listeners is that Katrina's story about what's happening in Wilcannia is just one story of the many stories that we have across all of our communities, where you've seen these incredible strength-based approaches of people coming together. And it's the best of public sector working with community and across jurisdictions to kind of focus on outcomes. So an absolute pleasure to thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Katrina. And just one last question that I would pose to both of you before we wrap up. What advice would you give to people considering a career within the APS, or more specifically in the NIAA?
I'll let you go first, Katrina.
Sure. I guess for me, I would tell people that the support that you are given within the agency, there is not one person that I have not called in my whole 4 years that has not been able to help or been able to refer me on to somebody that can help. It's an organisation that fosters growth, and it also is an organisation where you do really feel like you're making a difference. Whether, like I said earlier, it might be a small amount of funding or it could be a big amount of funding, the impacts that we see is inspiring for the new people coming into the organisation.
From my perspective, look, I'm a career public servant, and I think it's an incredibly noble profession. If you want to be an agent of change, the NIAA or the APS more broadly is a place to do that. There is no other profession that I can think of where you get to work across so many different sectors, so many different parts of business, in community, across jurisdictions, in the international space, with academia, to make a real difference in community. And we've heard from Katrina the really practical ways in which we make a difference in place. But there's also, that replicates into real influence at the national level in terms of advising government on policy, whether it be at the jurisdictional or at the national level. So I'm, if you want to come and have a great challenging career where we're strongly committed to investing in your professional aspirations and strongly committed to investing in your leadership, then come and work with us. We would love to have you.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Katrina and Letitia. Look, there's been so much going on in the frontline work of the APS this year, so thanks for your insights into what it's been like from an NIAA perspective. And thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to check out the latest edition of Connecting Us for more stories from your APS colleagues on the front lines. Thanks so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Today's show was written and presented by Mif Nazette, with editorial input from Richard Zilkowski. Dan Arnsworth did the sound editing, with original music by Ed Reading. Special thanks to Letitia Hope, Deputy CEO, and Katrina O'Donnell, Assistant Director at the National Indigenous Australians Agency. Thanks for listening. We look forward to sharing more APS stories like this one with you through Connecting Us.